So for our next conversation, points of convergence in wildlife trafficking and the jewelry supply chain, we have Rowena Watson. Rowena is the Chief Wildlife Conservation and Combating Wildlife Trafficking at the U.S. Department of State, which includes a whole lot of acronyms I don't understand other than your PhD. So, but thank you for your presentation. Let's get started.
Thanks. How's my voice working? Not working.
Your mic is off.
Not working. I did press the button.
Well, there are so many buttons on these microphones. It's like a new sound system, but.
And I don't want you to screeching. I know the screeching is the next issue here.
Go up
How's that?
right?
How's that? Oh, that's good. Well, my presentation is pretty different. I think it fits pretty well with Brad's yesterday morning when we were starting off. So I am from the State Department and I'm from the Bureau of Oceans, Environment and Science. I have been there working on these issues for a little over 10 years. And I think a lot of people don't even realize how heavily the State Department's involved in working on some of this stuff. And as a positive point, I know people have been touching on good news, bad news, does the future look gloomy? I will say that as someone who does a lot of multilateral negotiations, including on the Minamata Convention, and I was 2 weeks ago, I was in Vienna at the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. These issues really have come a long way. The illegal mining, trafficking in gemstones, wildlife trafficking, timber trafficking, land degradation, indigenous peoples. All of these things really are making a lot of progress, and this has been really fun for me to hear all of the conversations you guys are having, because I'm seeing that some of the stuff that happens on this very high level policy, which is pretty much my world, you guys are talking about it from the bottom up and really asking the questions about how are these things implemented? How are we really seeing the impacts and effects and assurances that we're working for? So this is kind of all fitting together for me. So I am going to focus somewhat on wildlife trafficking. When I first talked to Susan, so I forgot my thank yous. Susan and her team, thank you so much for finding me and inviting me. As I was saying, it's been exciting to be part of this. And also exciting to be back in Chicago. I went to school here, and my daughter graduated from Columbia College of Art and Science, so that's great. Anyway, that was fun too, to be in this auditorium. So I'm going to focus somewhat on wildlife trafficking. When I first talked with Susan about this, and she was explaining to me who this group would be and Convergence in the supply chain, I really had to get my head around how this was going to be useful for you. But what I want you to get from this talk is to know that the U.S. government is working on these issues in a whole of government approach, so not just the sanctions and the law enforcement, but really from all angles, from the development assistance, the capacity building, getting bad actors out, the sustainable supply chains. It's pretty impressive. So let me see, we'll see what questions you have, and take it away. Okay, so that's first slide. Let's go to the second slide. So wildlife trafficking, I think, how many of you are a little bit familiar with wildlife trafficking? You see it in the news, ivory, rhino horn, I'm guessing. So I think similarly to gems and precious metals, there's a huge legal trade in wildlife as well. So it took quite a while for the concept of wildlife trafficking as transnational organized crime, as an area for money laundering, as a problem to really come across. So, but it's very well established. It's not an emerging crime area anymore. It's very well recognized. And this slide about the definition is really talking about from the illegal take all the way through the supply chain. And so there's a lot of places where the criminality can come into play. And that's similar with the mining as well. And also the topic about, I want to say here, the habitat encroachment and increased human-wildlife conflict, a lot of the unregulated markets and things that we see with wildlife trafficking and illegal mining and that convergence. Of course, there's a big nexus with the COVID pandemic being a zoonotic disease. So that's also given us more reason to look at wildlife trafficking, but also all of these natural resource issues that are squeezing nature and our ecosystems. Okay. I think that's, next slide, please. So, working on wildlife trafficking, I think it's well recognized as being high profit, low risk, small penalties. This is a problem across all the nature crimes with timber trafficking, trafficking in gemstones and precious metals as well. And the fact that wildlife trafficking is a $5 to $23 illicit industry annually, that gets recognized. I have more slides and I have some case studies that I want to talk about with you guys, but the U.S. spends over $100,000 annually on capacity building with other countries to combat wildlife trafficking. We also have a lot of programs on illegal mining and addressing that and helping other countries. So again, there's a lot that we're doing in this space. Can I get slide number 4? Thanks. There's just a lot of uses, as I mentioned, for illegal wildlife. So it's been hard to identify quickly sometimes what is illegal and what's legal. Similarly to your industries, I think that being able to know what is legal and illegal is a really hard enforcement challenge. With wildlife, it might be easier than gold. I did work quite a bit on artisanal small-scale gold mining and working on supply chains in a previous part of my career. So I understand that with gold, it really doesn't look any different. It's not like the difference between bird types, which arguably is easier. Slide 5, thank you. So the security threats, the U.S. Being the State Department and working with intelligence agencies and with security agencies and law enforcement agencies, we have to justify our work. We compete with other difficult crime areas, and there's a huge body of work and expertise on working on drug trafficking. And so, but wildlife trafficking and nature crimes have very similar security threats, and that is well understood. There's a growing interest in looking at the convergence. So when we're looking at wildlife trafficking or trafficking in gemstones, how do those actors and studying that criminality, how does that actually expose bigger crime rings that are maybe trafficking in persons or trafficking in weapons or trafficking in drugs, which are arguably get some higher priorities sometimes, but we call it the soft underbelly of organized crime, that frequently looking at the nature crimes will expose bad actors, supply chains. They use the same trade routes. There's a lot of similarities, so it gives us a lot of opportunities. And as I mentioned, wildlife trafficking also spreads disease. I want to touch on this park rangers. I think that we heard a little bit about sometimes people are really in danger when they're trying to speak up about what's going wrong in countries, about illegal mining, about protected areas. So that's an area where the U.S. and the State Department is very engaged with indigenous and local peoples and with whistleblowers. So that's a very complex, but we're actively engaged in that arena as well. So I want to talk for a minute about nature crimes. Okay, can I get slide 5? Oh, this is more on wildlife trafficking and how far we've come with establishing this. Can you go back one slide? Okay. No, sorry, forward. I think maybe my slide order. Nope, back. Okay, basically, let me tell you. Can we please go to slide 5? Okay, yeah, the park rangers again. All right, so the park rangers I mentioned about the whistleblowers, you guys will have to forgive me a little bit. This isn't a talk that I'm used to giving, so I've sort of mashed a lot in here. Go to slide 6, please. So there's a lot of legislation on wildlife trafficking, but basically what I wanted to use this slide for, and you can go to the next slide actually, that we have a whole of government approach, as I mentioned, working on wildlife trafficking, but also a lot of these other issues. I think yesterday someone asked, where can we go to the US government, like which office is monitoring something? A lot of offices, they all have different angles. Some of them are law enforcement, some of them are capacity building, some of them are policy, but there's a tremendous amount of work. These are the members of the task force. So for wildlife trafficking, there's actually a task force of 17 federal agencies working on it. And so that's a pretty big deal. It's been established since 2014, and it really is a model for interagency coordination. And that exists also somewhat, maybe, I don't think that there's an executive order on it, but for trafficking in other illicit commodities. So that's an example where there's a lot of places for the concerns that are being raised here where you guys can plug in and engage depending on what you're working on. Okay, slide 8. Now I'm going to Convergence more broadly and the Nature Crime Initiative. So as I mentioned, there's frequently similar trafficking routes, and these converge with other financial crimes, and sometimes there's links to terrorism. We're very careful about talking about that because usually the focus is actually not on funding terrorist groups, and I think that gets overly emphasized sometimes when the real focus should be on transnational organized crime. That's where most of the actual money is and bad actors are. So the US has been working on putting these crimes together, especially the State Department is leading something called the Nature Crime Initiative, where we are looking at the convergence of these natural resources. So all of these natural resources have a basis in something that wants to be conserved. So unlike narcotics trafficking or waste trafficking, there's also a lot of investment in making sure that these natural resources are maintained and sustainably used and conserved. So talking about them with other governments as a basket has been really very successful. It gives us a chance to leverage similar laws, similar judicial systems. Sometimes there's cases where the money laundering and looking at the money laundering and the illicit financial flows is similar. And so talking to governments together instead of just talking to them about their illegal mining or just talking to them about their wildlife trafficking. So for instance, when I was at the meeting last month, Peru is very interested in talking about illegal mining and doing a resolution on that under the broader nature crimes framing. Next slide. So these are some of the ways that the government looks at convergence. I've been sort of splicing these in, but sometimes it's easier to just read them. But so this is just well established. So this is an exciting area to start get more progress. And I think one of the things that our office is doing at the State Department is trying to get our intelligence community to spend more time looking at nature crimes, and because we're saying the more you look, the more that you're going to find. Okay, slide 10. I talked a little bit about I'm getting ahead of myself, I see in my slides. So, but the Nature Crime Initiative there's also a Nature Crime Alliance, which we're working with NGO partners. So that's something I can mention here, which is that civil society and the private sector is really key to working on tackling these issues. And we've had long-standing partnerships with private sector and NGOs. I think the banking sector, but people just like this group that are really practitioners and wanting to know where these products are coming from and working to also funnel up really smart questions and insights about what you're seeing from your supply chains and what needs to happen on a policy level and on a law enforcement level. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so, as mentioned, these are very lucrative crimes and well established that there's lots of reasons to work on them. I want to read through a couple of really interesting cases, again, to prove to you that the U.S. government is very deeply involved in looking at this convergence topic. So here's an example of how gold and diamonds have been used to launder money from wildlife trafficking. In the fall of 2020, an international crime ring that trafficked illegally harvested shark fins was dismantled by a multi-agency law enforcement operation known as Operation Apex. And this was initiated by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, so the DEA. And they targeted 2 businesses in Florida and California and dozens of individual defendants whose activities included wildlife trafficking, trafficking in marijuana, and money laundering, and a conspiracy to disguise the proceeds of the unlawful activities that spanned at least 10 years. So this crime ring would deposit bulk cash from their illegal activities, including wildlife trafficking and drug trafficking, into third-party businesses and accounts that dealt in gold, precious metals, and jewels to hide their illicit proceeds. And the crime ring also deposited millions of dollars from illegal activities in third-party businesses and accounts located globally. So during the arrests of the defendants and searches of their homes and workplaces, they gathered up $3.9 million in multiple bank accounts, approximately $3 million in gold, silver, and other precious metals, along with $1 million in diamonds, approximately 18,000 marijuana plants, and 3.4 pounds of processed marijuana, multiple firearms, and harvested more than 6 tons of shark fins, as well as some totuado fish bladders. So that was a lot of reporting on that, but frequently it's also even hard to see all of that together, so that was a huge case. There's also a case with Chinese mining investments linked to wildlife trafficking in Africa and Latin America. I think we've seen quite a bit in DRC. So in wildlife trafficking, we like to say all roads lead to China, which regardless of whatever our bilateral relationship with China is, that is just true for wildlife trafficking. There's been a pattern of also not only the Chinese infrastructure projects for mining and logging and wildlife trafficking in Africa, but of course there's a lot of statistics now where that impact has gone to Latin America. And so, that the destruction there is being replicated from Africa into Latin America because the resources are being used up. Okay. I think I want to skip a couple of my cases. Hopefully I made enough of an impact there. There's also cases in DRC, there's quite a few cases in DRC that our agents have been working on, and there's a lot of problems with encroachment into protected areas. Okay, and there's a big case study for the notorious Lin Zhang crime syndicate in Malawi. That was a case that happened pretty recently where actually some Chinese kingpins were prosecuted operating there. Okay, let's go to slide 12, please. Okay, so lastly, I just want to talk for a second about some of the things that we're doing on corruption, on money laundering, and some other private sector engagements. So the State Department's been working quite a bit, I think, with Department of Treasury, but I think someone mentioned yesterday the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. So very recently, only in the last couple years, the FATF put out recommendations for how to look at illicit financial flows and money laundering with trafficking in wildlife trafficking, timber, and now then they expanded it to timber trafficking and other environmental crimes. So this is really new to look at those typologies, what the footprint is for looking at how is money laundered for mining, and trafficking in gemstones is different than trafficking in persons and drugs. And so there's some similarities in these different crime areas, but it also takes a lot of focused attention on those different sectors. And so the fact that the FATF is actually looking at this and drilling down into seeing how can we truly follow the money, not just talk about it, but what needs to happen in terms of the evidence and the banking sector and the private sector. So that's happening, which is really encouraging. I also want to talk about, so the financial sector, that's what I was talking about there, but also the partnerships that we have, like groups like you, and a lot of information that comes into that tracking, following the money is actually from the private sector, quite a bit. And then of course the banking sector and the private sector. For the transport sector, that I think the airlines is something that came up recently. For wildlife trafficking, looking at the transport sector is a very big deal because sometimes there's massive shipments and tons of timber or ivory that can be very easily concealed, especially in the maritime sector. So that's something that we work on quite a bit. But also the technology for looking at the airport, the security scanners, and how some of the technology that can be used to scan commodities really quickly. So even if there's not searches and agents, sometimes there's a lot of hope that there can be some scanning technology for luggage and hand luggage that could pick up certain wildlife. They're working on that, but I would think that the kind of electronic footprint of gold and gemstones would be pretty identifiable. So that would take a lot of creativity to go after that, but it's something to think about. But just giving you an idea of the scope of ways that these issues are really being looked at. And then of course the online sector, there's a lot of attention to how to deal with the cyber-enabled crime. So trafficking online is a really big problem for all kinds of illicit commodities, certainly for wildlife. And but there's a lot of private sector partnerships, public-private partnerships that are helping to address that. So that's another place that I think folks can consider engaging and monitoring. Is that my last slide? I think so. I wanted to mention one more thing before my final thank you, which is corruption. I think I talked yesterday with a few folks about corruption, and this is something that is, I think the crime, interestingly, transnational organized crime efforts to combat transnational organized crime are pretty different than working on corruption in some ways. They're very connected, but different. The working on nature crimes and the corruption nexus is the frontier that's right in front of us, and how to really drill down into that. And next year, 2023, is going to be a big year for the US hosting a number of conferences and initiatives on corruption. And so that's something you might want to think about, how you can plug into that. There's a lot of private sector engagement. How does corruption manifest in the mining sector? Where are the places where there needs to be interventions? How do those governments need to be approached, or those private sector companies or companies that are working in third countries? And so that's an area that we're also doing quite a bit of work. Okay, I
Welcome your questions.
All right, first of all, seriously. Okay, I'm learning. The microphone needs to heat up. I'm going to lead with the first question from our virtual audience, and then we'll be running the mic, and I see you up there. Okay, okay, so the first question, why is this still not on? Oh, I know what I need to do.
Jumping jacks.
How's this?
Yes.
Okay, the first question is from Christina Mollet, and she's asking, is there a formal system in place among these agencies to glean data or feedback specifically from the jewelry community, and how are the agencies tracking the effects of the policies? She says, I'm just one independent designer, but even I have seen ivory sold as bone.
Right. Wait, so she But she's talking about wildlife trafficking, right? Yes. So we actually, the State Department leads the coordination of the task force in my office specifically. So I do a lot of those meetings. We monitor the question was the results and the input, the data on it. So we just meet regularly and hash all of that out. There's a lot. And we also leverage information on the ground from our embassies. Did that get her answer her question?
I will ask her, there's about a 15-second lag. And I actually have several questions from the virtual, so we'll go back and forth, okay, Rachel? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation, Rowena. My name is Andrea Jose. I am a Peruvian jeweler. And yeah, one of the topics that you just mentioned that you're working on is the regulation. And this is one of my biggest questions. I'm working currently with formal artisanal miners in the Amazon rainforest, which is one of the tricky areas, of course, for all the topics you're working on. And how to create really a balance in regulation, because miners do complain a lot that they are put in the back of the illegal miners. You know, the miners I work with, they are mercury free, they use reforestation, they are doing the things right. But you know, there's a lot of like suffering, let's say in that sense, from the side of the miners, that there's no regulation that supports them, but instead a lot of banning, you know, a lot of you know, prejudices, and when creating the regulation, it's only thought about the illegal, about regulating the illegal industry instead of kind of regulating the ones that are doing the things right. And of course, if you create regulations that are based only in the illegal kind of context, there are a lot of problems because you cause more like a growth in the illegal industry. So how to create that balance when doing all these regulations?
So that's not my expert area, but I know enough about it to give a try at an answer. So I know that certainly, especially in Latin America, there's a huge amount of investment from the U.S. government, from not only our Bureau of Narcotics and Law Enforcement, so from that law enforcement piece, but also from USAID on the development piece. So talking about giving positive reinforcement where there's positive action. So I think that there's a push-pull, and it's not always, everything's not about enforcement, everything's not about law enforcement. There's also demand reduction, there's also behavior change, and reinforcing when it is being done right. And that's really important too. People can't feel like the story is always catching up, that there needs to be a front wave of people who are doing it right. From my perspective on how to work on that, I would say that is an appeal to the government to tell their good news story, have their legal system put forward more, and use that as a model to promote more awareness of what is being done right and give those people some attention that they need and deserve.
All right, now we have a question from the virtual audience. Chandra Leah Horn would like to know if the government has a site where they list wildlife restrictions and bans, and also how their restrictions compare with CITES annexes.
CITES annexes?
CITES.
Yeah. So most of the things that are illegal to import to the United States they won't get a CITES permit. That's what they're talking about. And then in terms of if there's just one bad list of stuff, probably the Fish and Wildlife Service that regulates the U.S. Endangered Species Act and also does the CITES permitting. They probably have some stuff on their website. I know that the U.S.'s near total ivory ban import has very specifics on ivory imports, for instance. So some of that is available online. We have Ken next.
Hi, thank you for the interesting presentation. It was very exhaustive. We touched upon a lot of points, which is very interesting, but I also saw big governance somewhere in your presentation. You mentioned on the slide, and in the end, you mentioned corruption. And that interests me a lot because for most stakeholders, it's very difficult to deal with big governance. And I think that you're one of the actors which is can have the most impact on that. And I work a lot in the RC, and so there as well, we see the impact of these transnational networks. But in the end, often there's a big, there's a big part of the problem is weak governance. So I was wondering, like, what is what is your State Department strategy on that? How to deal with weak governance? Because that's something that obstructs all of us. And I think,
Thank you. So that's all of our work, right? We put those in our ambassadors' talking points. We try to make those points really clear. We try to leverage them with other things that they care about. I think that it's always a challenge when there really is very low capacity. So there's always the question, well, if you do more for us and pay more and give us more programs, we would do better. But sometimes, at the end of the day, it really is a question of, does the government care or they don't? And so I think that we push on that quite a bit to make that case about weak governance and corruption. They're very different points, but especially when they have good laws and they're not enforcing them, right? That's something that we address all the time in DRC. Our embassy's really engaged in that.
All right, now another question from the virtual audience, and then we're going to have time for one more question after that. Is state interested in what all of us see in the jewelry supply chain? For example, if we see ivory being sold on 47th Street, basically, does government want to hear what we see, and how does that happen?
Right, yeah. Well, absolutely. I think that the data, showing the data and the evidence, that's one of the things that in the State Department, in this high-level policy world, we can't possibly know what's happening on the ground all the time. That's why we have NGO partners, that's why we have private sector partners, that's why we hold roundtables and stakeholder groups, is to find out, what's really happening on the ground. Of course, we have our embassies, but in terms of how that information would go forward, I guess there's a huge network of folks working on this stuff and finding someone where you could turn that in. There aren't a lot of just open portals for data, but there are channels and networks of communication. So,
Well, and just in addition, from the virtual audience, Sarah Yude is in virtually, and she said, "Hi, Christina. I'm happy for your question to get answered. But FYI, a big part of what JVC does is collect that info from the trade and pass it to government. We're always happy to receive that info and coordinate transmission to our government partners." So one more question.
Christina, I have her hand up.
But I didn't work here tonight, I can answer. I actually asked it beside you. Yeah. Go ahead, Anna.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Ana Sierra, I come from Colombia, and I wonder what policy do you have with issues that do not have to do directly with an animal being exported or transported, but overlap also gold, illicit extraction, and wildlife. For example, there's jaguars that go from Central America to Argentina, and many different issues, industrialization and so on, but mostly deforestation is threatening them. And that deforestation comes out of illicit mechanized gold extraction. So the jaguars are not actually being killed to produce whatever, but they are being killed because of issues that have to do with gold. Does the U.S. Government has some policies?
Yes.
And how can you support us in fighting that? Thank you.
Thank you. So I didn't want to keep reading my points that my team put together to kind of, so I'm sorry if I had probably a little bit more on that in here prepared, but I will say we work on deforestation, we work on forest conservation, we work on trafficking in timber, and trafficking in wildlife and wildlife conservation. So these teams all kind of compare notes and really work together and understand that sequence of exactly what you're talking about. And I think that we, not only do we understand it and take a hard look at it, we figure out how to talk to the governments about the drivers for these problems. So we might be seeing more human-jaguar conflict because of the mining, because of the deforestation. And now one of the things that we talk about more and more is the risk for zoonotic disease emergence and spillover because of all of that disruption of that ecosystem.
Thank you.
And we actually have time for one more. Everybody's being so efficient with their answers.
So we have Christina and Eric.
because I think we did talk about it yesterday. And this sort of echoes the gentleman's question right in front of me, is when we run into significant government corruption, is there a place in the US government to talk to about that? It's been a real challenge. And it's a regular occurrence when we're working in Africa.
Yeah. So my office is a great place, and my Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science is a great place to bring those cases, and also to the embassies. I think that, especially with American companies, we appreciate very specific examples. So instead of just saying, there's corruption in this sector, we can say this and this, and especially if there's cumulative evidence, sometimes then we can even work on sanctions, or things like Magnitsky and stuff come into play when they're government officials. So there are a lot of things that we can do with that data. So my bureau, but then also the embassies, and there's a lot of interagency partners as well. Thank you.
All right, well I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I think it's a really interesting viewpoint for all of us to get, and more knowledge for us to put into our idea bank when we're trying to solve problems for the jewelry industry. So
great, and I think you guys have had really fantastic insights, and all the questions you're tackling are super relevant for all the things that I'm hearing up in those upper policy levels. So thank you.
all right.